Bismillah, alhamdulillahi wa kafa, wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammadin Mustafa wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wafa. We are now on what looks like being the last of these 6 sessions, exploring one of the subtler aspects of human consciousness. The mystery within is always much more interesting and important to us and important to society than any mystery without. Our modern civilization is able to penetrate the mysteries of the far galaxies with the Hubble Space Telescope and to split the atom, but those are all outward things. Inwardly, we seem to be more a mess than ever, with antidepressant sales rocketing, relationships not working, everybody told to be an individual, to be themselves, to discover themselves, to express themselves, but with there being no recognized consensus as to what the self might be, if indeed it exists at all. And this great paradox of our civilization is hurting a lot of people. We are not given a coherent sense of self. We're not really told what it means to be part of a tradition, part of a country, part of a region, part of a family, part of a gender, part of anything really. We're all atoms floating around. And on the Rousseau-esque discourse of the Enlightenment, this is going to set us free. All of those other forms of belonging made us inauthentic, made us comply to somebody else's story, and that we can only be truly happy if we are free of all stories other than our own. Well, that shows a rather profound ignorance of human nature, because human beings are designed to exist in a reality of stories which are about ancestors and are about truths and are about genders and things that are real. We don't flourish when we're taken out of those coordinates and told to exist in space on our own. But this inner life of which the moderns are ignorant is precisely the topic of these lectures, and really the subject of all of Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya, even where he talks about things that seem to be outward matters of religion, matters of doctrine, how you do the Hajj and so forth. He is talking about how to make those things a genuine part of our inner life. That's what he means by calling the book Reviving the Sciences of Religion. The sciences of religion are known in great detail, but how to make them live within ourselves, which is the essential part of our own lives, is what is concerning him. So we've looked at questions of intention, we've looked at questions of sincerity, ikhlas, and we've made a start in the last lecture on the question of sidq, of truthfulness. We struggled a bit with the translation. Being real, being authentic. Often these terms which young people like are quite close to the truth, because they see in the establishment world a lot of falsity. Not only is almost all entertainment based on the falsehood of it being about actors or people who are singing somebody else's songs, and there's no authenticity in any of it. But also the forms of behavior which are required in order to meet the exacting standards of our humanity required by social media, messaging, advertising and so forth, tend to impose upon us an alienation from everything that once constituted the basis for human happiness. Even the outward form of human beings is increasingly manipulated with piercings and tattoos and various forms of cosmetic surgery. We are, in order to be ourselves, actually changing ourselves a lot. And the whole drug industry is another example of that. People aren't happy with the way they are, so they get drunk or they take drugs in order to be something that perhaps makes them feel more free or more authentic. But of course, it's just a chemically induced dream, and therefore less real. So our culture is in this state of confusion and inauthenticity, distance even from culture. And as a result, what we're finding is that people are looking for alternatives, inward technologies, and the great tragedy of the age is that the religions sometimes are no longer prioritizing that. That if you go to your local mosque in England because you're suffering from depression or you want to know the meaning of life or something, it may be that there really is nobody there who can really understand you, sit you down and be real with you, be sadiq with you, and share with you these extraordinary spiritual toolboxes which have come down to us from earlier Islamic generations, these medicine chests, these books of healing, because those communities are too wrapped up in their own issues and anxieties and identities, and they're not really geared up for therapy. And this is a great shame, because we have this extraordinary richness and there's so much need out there, and we're not putting the supply and demand together very successfully. If we did, subhanallah, the country would look different. We've already had in the first 9 months of this year, 2020, 80 shahadas at the Cambridge Mosque, and there's still, despite the mess of the ummah and the communities, people are looking for tawheed and for truth. We keep the doors shut, but somehow they manage to force their way in. But people need this shifa, this rahmatun wa shifa. So seeing the Ihya as a book of therapy, psychotherapy is a bit too clinical, but deep healing, organic healing perhaps, natural therapy, it's to do with the fitrah, getting back to what we really are, is going to be a good way of getting our heads around what the book is for and why it's important to us. And once we see that really deen itself is in it, the virtues and the practices and everything is in the book, we can see that religion is just heaven's way of keeping us healthy, because we can get pretty sick. Bani Adam can get pretty sick, and all of those Quranic stories about for every Musa there's a Fir'aun, for every Ibrahim there's a Nimrod. Human beings, when left to their own devices, when being themselves and glorifying, deifying their egos and their nafs, become a really subversive principle. And today it's worse, because the pharaonic structures of our age are doing worse things than were attempted by any earlier generation, because they're destroying the ecosystem itself, which even Fir'aun couldn't have managed. So in this book we have been looking at forms of human dignity and uprightness. That's a good way of seeing it. That to the extent that we are unreal with people and we are devious, and we are unreal and devious with ourselves, telling ourselves stories in order to get us certain advantages, sometimes even standing before the Lord and saying Allahu Akbar, but I want to think about this and I'm going to do that, then we're not people who are real and not people who are authentic. And it is the mark of the prophetic and the spiritual guide that that person's absolute inner integration and holistic fullness and sincerity is so overwhelming that human beings are quite perceptive often of other people's states, particularly if they're overwhelming, are healed simply by the proximity of that person, simply by sitting with them. The hadith indicate that people used to go to the Holy Prophet just to look at him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, because in his presence they felt this kind of healing descend, this sakina. But not for us, unfortunately, because we're so full of our issues and agitations and preferences and impatiences, and it's not really working out well for us, so we have to pop pills when we get too much of this modern lifestyle. But the Islamic lifestyle gives us a much healthier kind of pill, because it restores us to what is the normal form of the metabolism anyway. So nobility comes about through being real, through telling the truth, through being honest, through being modest, and through being sincere. So we're seeing that this is part of the takreem of Bani Adam, karramna Bani Adam. Allah says we have ennobled the descendants of Adam. We alone walk upright. We alone can have intentions. We alone can be the object of moral judgment. we alone can produce works of art. Of the millions of species on the planet, we're kind of alone and really different. Part of nature, but really not just natural things. There's something different about us. And religion particularly undermines that because of its very strong emphasis on moral excellence. So we have ennobled the descendants of Adam indicates that we are being called to live up to a dignified and an aristocratic and an honourable, upright way of being. And that comes about through sincerity, through being honest with people, through not telling lies, and therefore through not putting ourselves in morally dubious situations that might invite us to tell lies in the first place. Now, in the section that we're about to read, the Imam, who's always very attuned to the messy realities of our life, will say certain things about some situations in which maybe certain truths need to be exposed more than other truths, because this is the world that we live in. And this is one of the differences really between the Islamic vision and, say, the vision of the Gospels, which is very absolute in its utopian idealism, non-violence. The legionary asks you to carry his pack for a mile, you carry it for 2 miles just to be nice. You turn the other cheek, you don't resist, you're kind of celibate, you have no political existence. It's kind of all otherworldly, angelic stuff, but it's not really the basis for running a real society. Not everybody can be celibate, not everybody can be non-violent. You're going to need police, children, and this is something that in Christian history has had to be adapted to in complex ways. In the Islamic context, because we follow the one who is, in our sense, al-insan al-kamil, all of the prophets were perfect, and there's a certain perfection about the gospel image of Jesus, to be sure. But the Islamic vision of al-insan al-kamil is the universal man. In other words, he shows the potential nobility of the human creature in every aspect of his quite broad, diverse, ramifying behavioral possibilities. How to be excellent in business, how to be excellent in being a parent, how to be excellent in defending your people in times of war, how to be excellent leading worship, how to be excellent in all of those different areas. He is that, al-insan al-kamil, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So this is why Islam is described as the meeting between God as such and man as such. There's no incarnation, no blurring, no thing that is both in some painfully paradoxical way, but rather a human being who is fully human, but who is fully sadiq and directed in a real and complete and sincere and truthful way towards the source of his being, one who is al-abd al-mahad, the true absolute slave. So all of this book of the Ihya, you could say, is a commentary on the Sunnah, not just because he puts lots of hadith in it, but because it's explaining why following the Sunnah makes us noble and extraordinary human beings, because we are once again in the form of perfection that is ultimately prophetic rather than in our own form, which is fiery, egotistic, nafs, hawa, shaitan, whatever it is that the self is attracted to at a particular moment. Restraint, dignity, forbearance, and in the last lesson we saw a lot about forbearance and gentleness, and these are part of it. So we're talking about human excellence, emulating al-insan al-kamil in the real world, not in some angelic sphere, but in the real world with its thorns and difficulties and paradoxes. So in a world where you have to make difficult decisions, for compromises nonetheless to be expressions of perfect sidq and ikhlas, that's the ethical gift which the example of the Sunnah shows us. So let's move then through the final section of this journey through this, to me, very extraordinary and life-changing book, really. If we were to do this, it would be something else. And he moves in on this, the final section. بيان حقيقة الصدق ومعناه ومراتبه. An exposition of the true nature of sidq. What is it? Its meaning and its degrees, its levels. It can be truthful to different extents. By now we're familiar with the Imam's method. اعلم أن لفظ الصدق يستعمل في 6 معان. MashaAllah. You should know that the word truthfulness or sidq is used for 6 different concepts. This is classic methodical Ghazalian psychic mapping here. So here are the 6, and he's going to go through them one by one presently. صدق في القول, being truthful in speech. وصدق في النية والإرادة, being truthful in what you intend and will. وصدق في العزم, truthfulness in truly being determined to do something, determination. وصدق في الوفاء بالعزم, truthfulness in carrying out one's purposes. وصدق في العمل, truthfulness in acting. وصدق في تحقيق مقامات الدين كلها, and truthfulness in bringing about all of the different degrees of religion. فمن اتصف بالصدق في جميع ذلك, whoever is described as being truthful in all of these 6 things, فهو صديق. This is the person who is صديق, is an emphatic form of the root. The root is صاد, دال, قاف. صادق is the usual active participle. You can also say صديق. You can also say صدوق. صديق is the intensive form, the one who is absolutely truthful. So if you have all of these 6, that's what you are. لأنه مبالغة في الصدق, because it is صدق to the utmost degree. ثم هم أيضا على درجات, and these things are also ranked in degrees. ومن كان له حظ في الصدق في شيء من الجملة فهو صادق بالإضافة إلى ما فيه صدقه. So whoever has truthfulness in one of these is said to be truthful with respect to that thing only. But the Siddiq, this prophetic degree, which has this extraordinary radiant power, the beauty of sainthood, the goodness, the selflessness that irradiates miraculously from certain human beings. Why is it that they ask Sayyidina Yusuf in the jail, he's just a prisoner, to interpret the king's dream? Because they know who he is. Yusuf wa ayyuha siddiq, you truth-telling person. And one of the meanings of this is that you tell the truth about dreams and so forth. And this is all to do with the perspicuity, the firasa that we've been speaking about, the insight that the believer has into the inner workings of somebody else's spirit, because that is also one of the criteria for dream interpretation as well, which is not simple and needs special ijazah or permission in Islam. الصدق الأول صدق اللسان. So, truthfulness number 1, truthfulness of the tongue. And this is what we normally mean when we say telling the truth. وذلك لا يكون إلا في الإخبار. This pertains only to the conveying of information. أو فيما يتضمن الإخبار وينبه عليه, or anything that incorporates the conveyance of information and indicates it. So, for instance, a wink. It's not speech, but nonetheless it can communicate information, and so it can be truthful or it can be untrue. If I wink at somebody I love and that's sincere, looks the same as if I'm in a stage play and I'm winking at somebody because the stage directions require that. They look the same outwardly, but the intention is different, and the sidq is present in the first only. والخبر إما أن يتعلق بالماضي أو بالمستقبل. The conveying of information pertains to the past or to the future only. وفيه يدخل الوفاء بالوعد والخلف فيه. And in this is incorporated also the principle of keeping promises and breaking promises. وَحَقٌّ عَلَى كُلِّ عَبْدٍ أَنْ يَحْفَظَ أَلْفَاظَهُ. It is the duty of every human being to guard his words, to be guarded in his speech, we might say. فَلَا يَتَكَلَّمْ إِلَّا بِالصِّدْقِ, and to speak only truthfully. وَهَذَا هُوَ أَشْهَرُ أَنْوَاعِ الصِّدْقِ وَأَظْهَرُهَا. This is the most obvious and best known of the forms of truthfulness, being, telling the truth. فَمَنْ حَفَظَ لِسَانَهُ عن الإخبار عن الأشياء على خلاف ما هي عليه فهو الصادق. So whoever restrains himself from saying things about the world which do not correctly describe it is considered to be صادق. In other words, a truthful person. ولكن لهذا الصدق كمالان. So we get a subdivision here in this first category. But there's two forms of perfection in this truth-telling. And this is where we get into the question of, in the real world, how can you practice these ideal virtues completely when the world is complex and messy and imperfect? أحدهما, the first of these perfections, الاحتراز عن المعارض, to avoid equivocation or saying things that might convey something other than what they seem to mean. Hints, something like that. معارض. فقد قيل في المعارض مندوحة عن الكذب. In equivocation, there is a connection to, or an inclination towards, falsehood. وذلك لأنها تقوم مقام الكذب, because they seem to be performing the same function as a lie. إذ المحظور من الكذب تفهيم الشيء على خلاف ما هو عليه في نفسه. Because what's forbidden in lying is bringing about an understanding about a thing which is other than what that thing actually is in itself. إلا أن ذلك مما تمص إليه الحاجة. But there can be certain urgent reasons why this is necessary. So this is to do with the realism of ethics in the world. وتقتضيه المصلحة في بعض الأحوال, and in which there's utility which requires it in some situations. And it's not to say things absolutely as they are in a kind of innocent and naive way in all situations. Sometimes you have to be guarded, sometimes you have to be a little ambiguous in what you say. And this does not conflict with the principle of sidq. This is what the Imam's getting at. وفي تأديب الصبيان ومن يجري مجراهم. So for instance, in disciplining children and the like, to be absolutely clear with children about everything, well, maybe that's not quite appropriate. You don't always tell them things exactly as they're going to be. Sometimes you might indicate a threat without actually meaning it, for instance. وفي الحذر عن الظلمة. Also, you can use this, and he talks about this elsewhere in the Ihya, where he has a whole section on lying, آفات الكذب, the defect of lying. Some circumstances where telling a lie is not a sin. So here he says, in order to take precautions against tyrants, وفي قتال الأعداء والاحتراز عن اطلاعهم على أسرار الملك. So for instance, when you're in a war, you might need to keep the enemy from becoming acquainted with the secrets of your country. Sidq, telling the truth, doesn't mean that you go to the Ministry of Propaganda in Berlin during the Second World War, and because you're a Sadiq person, you just spill the beans and tell them everything. No. In our real messy world, it's not as simple as that. فَمَنِ اضْطَرَّ إِلَى شَيْءٍ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. So whoever is forced into that kind of equivocal or indirect speech, not quite spilling the beans, فصدقه فيه أن يكون نطقه فيه لله تعالى فيما يأمره الحق به ويقتضيه الدين. So in this context, if you're afraid of a tyrant or something wiping you out, wiping your family out if you tell him everything that's going on, sidq in this situation, truthfulness, consists in ensuring that your speech is all to comply with what God has ordered you to do and which religion requires. In other words, you're not being indirect in what you say in order to get out of a difficult situation for yourself. You're doing it in order to uphold truth and justice. فَإِذَا نَطَقَ بِهِ فَهُوَ الصَّادِقُ. And if you speak in that way, you are still truthful. وَإِنْ كَانَ كَلَامُهُ مُفْهِمًا غَيْرَ مَا هُوَ عَلَيْهِ. Even if what you say seems to indicate something other than what is the case. لأن الصدق ما أريد لذاته بل للدلالة على الحق والدعاء إليه. Because truthfulness is not desired for itself, but insofar as it points towards the truth and invites people to it. فلا ينظر إلى صورته بل إلى معناه. So you don't look at the form of the speech, but at the meaning of the speech. So if a political dissident has escaped from prison in a totalitarian country and is hiding in your attic and the police come, sidq actually can require you to be equivocal and to not tell the police that the man is in your attic. نعم في مثل هذا الموضع ينبغي أن يعدل إلى المعارض ما وجد إليه سبيلا. In situations like this, it's appropriate that one should find not a lie, but at least an equivocal way of speaking ambiguously to the extent that one can. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا توجه إلى سفر ورى بغيره. The Holy Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, when he was readying himself for a journey, would give the impression that he was doing something else. وذلك كي لا ينتهي الخبر إلى الأعداء فيقصد, so that the news wouldn't get to his enemies and he would be sought out and assassinated. وليس هذا من الكذب في شيء. This is not lying at all. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليس بكذاب من أصلح بين اثنين فقال خيرا أو نما خيرا. The liar is not he who brings about reconciliation between two people and says what is good or indicates what is good. This is a hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, and it is important. Sometimes somebody's wife comes to you and said, I heard that my husband once, a long time ago, had a relationship with so-and-so, and I know it was, etc., etc. In that situation, you can say no, because you're just bringing about islah, and there's no khair, there's no good in saying yes. So sidq, truthfulness, is not always exactly the same thing as telling the truth. That's what the Imam is telling us. ورخص في النطق على وفق المصلحة في ثلاث مواضع. There is a rukhsa, a permission in Sharia, in speaking according to public interest rather than what's strictly true in three circumstances. Man aslaha bayna ithnain, whoever is bringing about reconciliation between two people. وَمَنْ كَانَ لَهُ زَوْجَتَانِ, and whoever has two wives. It may be necessary to sometimes be diplomatic. وَمَنْ كَانَ فِي مَصَالِحِ الْحَرْبِ, and in the interest of fighting a war. You keep your secret. And Second World War was, deception was very important. Operation Mincemeat, when the Allies, I think, were about to invade Sicily, but they deceived the Germans into thinking they were going to invade Greece instead. And there was a whole complex, elaborate plot with fake documents. So the Germans moved their tank divisions or whatever it was to Italy and out of Greece, to Greece and out of Italy. And anyway, so that's an example of sidq, truthfulness, not requiring telling the truth. And any serious moral system is going to recognize that this is sometimes morally appropriate. وَالصِّدْقُ هَا هُنَا يَتَحَوَّلُ إِلَى النِّيَّةِ. In this situation, truthfulness really is just about intention. فَلَا يُرَاعَ فِيهِ إِلَّا صِدْقُ النِّيَّةِ وَإِرَادَةُ الْخَيْرِ. In this situation, what counts is not so much the formality of what you say, but the sincerity of your intention and intending to do good. فَمَهُمَا صَحَّ قَصْدُهُ وَصَدَقَتْ نِيَّتُهُ. To the extent that such a person's intention is sound and his Purpose is good. وَتَجَرَّدَتْ لِلْخَيْرِ إِرَادَتُهُ, and he simply wants to do good, nothing else. كَانَ صَادِقًا وَصِدِّيقًا كَيْفَمَا كَانَ لَفْظُهُ. Then he is صادق and siddiq, whatever it is that he's actually saying. ثُمَّ التَّعْرِيضُ فِيهِ أَوْلَى. But still, not telling a lie, but speaking in a way that might be interpreted in a certain way that is beneficial, is preferable. Because you always try to avoid a direct falsity wherever you can. وطريقه ما حكي عن بعضهم أنه كان يطلبه بعض الظلمة وهو في داره. For instance, it's narrated about one of the early Muslims that a tyrant king was seeking him when he was in his house, sent the police to arrest him. فقال لزوجته خطي بإصبعك دائرة وضعي الإصبع عليها وقولي ليس هو ها هنا. So he says to his wife, when the police come, draw a circle and push your finger down and say, he's not here. واحترز بذلك عن الكذب. In that way, he wasn't actually telling a lie. So is he here? Here? No, he's not here. So what she means is this little circle that I've just drawn, what the police thinks is the house. So this is preferable because an actual lie has not formally been told. وَدَفَعَ الظَّالِمَ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. So he was preserved and his household from the corrupt king. فَكَانَ قَوْلُهُ صِدْقًا. What was said was still truthful. وَأَفَهَمَ الظَّالِمُ أَنَّهُ لَيْسَ فِي الدَّارِ. But the corrupt king simply received the impression that he was not at home. فَالْكَمَالُ الأول في اللفظ أن يحترز عن صريح اللفظ وعن المعاريض أيضا إلى عند الضرورة. So this first perfection, okay, 6 sections. The first is telling the truth. The first of these, of the 2 subsections under the first section, is perfection in avoiding saying things that might deceive people or not tell the truth. But he's explained that in order to be perfect in this degree, avoid as much as you can saying anything that is not true, and avoid also saying things that are deliberately misleading as much as you can. إِلَّا عِنْدَ الضَّرُورَةِ, he says, unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so that's the first moral issue that is clarified for us. So the second of these perfections, وَالْكَمَالُ الثَّانِي أن يراعي معنى الصدق في ألفاظه التي يناجي بها ربه عز وجل. That he should maintain truthfulness in the words which he uses in order to converse with his Lord. As when he says, وَجَّهْتُ وَجْهِيَ لِلَّذِي فَطَرَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. At the beginning of the prayer he might say, I've directed my face to he who created the heavens and the earth. فَإِنَّ قَلْبَهُ إِنْ كَانَ مُنصَرِفًا عَنِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى مَشْغُولًا بِأَمَانِيِّ الدُّنْيَا وَشَهَوَاتِهَا. Because his heart, if it's distracted from God and preoccupied with hopes and desires of the world, فَهُوَ كَاذِب, then that person is actually telling a lie. So if you say, I direct myself and I'm doing this for God, but actually you're not, that is also telling a lie. وَقَوْلِهِ إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone we worship and you alone we ask for help. وَقَوْلِهِ أَنَا عَبْدُ اللَّهِ. I'm Allah's slave. فإنه إذا لم يتصف بحقيقة العبودية, because if such a person who says, I'm Abdullah, I'm Allah's slave, isn't actually qualified by the real nature of servanthood, كان له طلب سوى الله. He has some aspiration which is other than the pleasure of God. ولم يكن كلامه الصدق, and his word is not truthful. ولو طولب يوم القيامة بالصدق في قوله. And if he, on the last day, is called to account for the truthfulness of his saying, I am Allah's slave, لا عجز عن تحقيقه, he would be unable to prove that he'd been sincere. فإنه إن كان عبدا لنفسه أو عبدا لدنياه أو عبدا لشهواته لم يكن صادقا في قوله. Because if in reality he'd been a slave of his ego or a slave of his passions or a slave of dunya, he wouldn't have been telling the truth. So this is about lying to God in forms of worship. This is the second of these perfections. That's something we need to avoid. وَكُلُّ مَا تَقَيَّدَ الْعَبْدُ بِهِ فَهُوَ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ. Everything that we are attached to, we are enslaved by. كما قال عيسى عليه السلام, as Sayyidina Isa said, يا عبيد الدنيا, O slaves of this world. وقال نبينا صلى الله عليه وسلم تعس عبد الدينار تعس عبد الدرهم وعبد الحلة وعبد الخميصة. It's a famous hadith in Bukhari. Wretched is the slave of the gold coin. Wretched also the slave of the silver coin, and the slave of the robe, and the slave of the silken cloth. سمى كل من تقيد قلبه بشيء عبدا له. In this hadith, the Holy Prophet is describing anybody who's attached to those things in his heart as a slave of those things. وإنما العبد الحق لله عز وجل من عتق أولا عن غير من عتق أولا عن غير الله تعالى. The real slave of Allah is the one who is liberated from slavehood to any other than Him. فصار حرا مطلقا, and becomes absolutely free. فإذا تقدمت هذه الحرية صار القلب فارغا. So when this freedom is real, the heart is free and empty. فحلت به العبودية لله. And then we become slaves for God. فتشغله بالله وبمحبته وتقيد باطنه وظاهره بطاعته. So he's focused only on Allah and on the love of Allah, and his inward nature and his outward nature are attached to his obedience. فلا يكون له مراد إلا الله تعالى. And he has only one purpose, which is seeking his Lord. ثم قد يجاوز هذا إلى مقام آخر أسنى منه يسمى الحرية. And this can go to another more exalted degree, which is called hurriya, freedom. And in a lot of the early Sufi manuals, like the Risala of Imam Qushayri, you have chapters on hurriya, freedom. What do we say when the path of deen is the path of freedom? وهو أن يعتق أيضا عن إرادته لله من حيث هو بل يقنع بما يريده الله تعالى له من تقريب أو إبعاد. In other words, he is free of hoping for things from God in that kind of aspirational, desirous way, but is completely content with whatever Allah wills for him. فتفنى إرادته في إرادة الله. So his will is annihilated in the divine will. وهذا عبد عتق عن غير الله فصار حرا. And this is a slave who has been liberated from everything other than God and becomes truly free. ثم عاد وعتق عن نفسه فصار حرا وصار مفقودا لنفسه موجودا لسيده. So he is lost to himself, present to his Lord. إن حركه تحرك. If his Lord makes him move, he moves. وإن سكنه سكن. If he makes him still, he is still. وإن ابتلاه رضي. If he tests him, he is content. ولم يبقى فيه متسع لطلب والتماس واعتراض. And he has no space within him left for objecting to anything. بل هو بين يدي الله تعالى كالميت بين يدي الغاسل. He is in God's hand like the corpse in the hands of the washer. وهذا منتهى الصدق في العبودية لله تعالى. This is considered to be the utmost point of slavehood to Allah. فالعبد الحق هو الذي وجوده لمولاه لا لنفسه. The true slave is the one whose whole being is for his Lord, not for himself. وهذه درجة الصديقين, and this is the degree of the Siddiq. وأما الحرية عن غير الله فدرجات الصادقين وبعدها تتحقق العبودية لله تعالى وما قبل هذا فلا يستحق صاحبه أن يسمى صادقا ولا صديقا فهذا هو معنى الصدق في القول. So he comes to an end of this first of his 6 sections here by indicating that within telling the truth there's different degrees, and he's taken us on this sort of mystical flight really to talk about true freedom, which is more or less the complete opposite of what we mean nowadays by freedom, which generally means freedom to pursue dunya things. No, it's freedom from dunya things, which always end up breaking, turning to ashes, causing us problems, and being enslaved only to the one who never breaks and never lets us down. So this is, in the technical terminology of tasawwuf, known as hurriya, freedom, and it means complete acceptance of everything that Allah has decreed in terms of forms of worship, but also in terms of His decrees for us in our lives. And these are the siddiqeen, the extraordinary people, the real truth tellers. So that concludes the first of our 6 sections, which is truth telling. And now, الصدق الثاني في النية والإرادة. Second truthfulness is in intention and will. ويرجع ذلك إلى الإخلاص. This is basically about إخلاص, sincerity. وهو ألا يكون له باعث في الحركات وسكنات إلا الله تعالى. And this is that we have no motive in moving or in not moving except for Allah. فإن مازجه شوب من حظوظ النفس بطل صدق النية. And the truthfulness, the purity of the niyyah is damaged to the extent that some of the portions or the desires of the self intrude. وصاحبه يجوز أن يسمى كاذبا. Such a person can be described as a liar. كما روينا في فضيلة الإخلاص من حديث الثلاثة حين يسأل العالم, as we narrated when we were talking about ikhlas, the famous hadith about the scholar. ما عملت فيما علمت فقال فعلت كذا وكذا. The scholar is asked, what did you do with what you learned? And he said, I did this and that. فقال الله تعالى كذبت, you are speaking falsely. بل أردت أن يقال فلان عالم. You just wanted people to say that you were a learned person. فإنه لم يكذبه وإن لم يكذبه ولم يقل له لم تعمل ولكن كذبه في إرادته ونيته. So he's not saying that his words were inaccurate, but that his intention and his will were inaccurate. He studied, he did study, but for the wrong reason. So this is the second. وقد قال بعضهم الصدق صحة التوجه في القصد. Truthfulness is a sound orientation in one's purpose. وكذلك قول الله تعالى والله يشهد أن المنافقين لكاذبون. And Allah witnesses that the hypocrites, the munafiqeen, are liars. وقد قالوا إنك لرسول الله. They did say, you are Allah's messenger. وهذا صدق. In this they were telling the truth. ولكن كذبهم, but Allah called them liars. لا من حيث نطق اللسان, not because of what their tongues were saying. بل من حيث ضمير القلب, but because of what was hidden in their hearts. وكان التكذيب يتطرق إلى الخبر. وهذا القول يتضمن إخبارا بقرينة الحال. So this, what they were saying, even though it was outwardly true, nonetheless contained an indication of what they were within. إذ صاحبه يظهر من نفسه أنه يعتقد ما يقول فكذب في دلالته بقرينة الحال على ما في قلبه. So one can see from the outward state of people something that indicates that what they are saying is insincere, even if it's formally true. فإنه كذب في ذلك وإن لم يكذب فيما يلفظ به. Such a person is telling a lie even if his words are not lying. فيرجع أحد معاني الصدق إلى خلوص النية. So he's saying this second concept of truthfulness is basically about sincerity of intention. فكل صادق فلا بد وأن يكون مخلصا. Every truth-telling person must be sincere for there really to be a sidq. الصدق الثالث, the third type of truthfulness, صدق العزم, to have a true determination, to be truly, sincerely determined to do something, not just saying that you want to do it. فإن الإنسان قد يقدم العزم على العمل. Quite often, he says, human beings can determine to do something sometime before they actually do it. فيقول في نفسه إن رزقني الله مالا تصدقت بجميعه أو بشطره. Someone might say in his own self, if Allah gives me wealth, I will give it in charity, all of it or half of it. أو إن لقيت عدوا في سبيل الله تعالى قاتلت ولم أبالي وإن قتلت. If I meet an enemy in the path of Allah, I shall fight and I shan't mind even if I'm killed. وإن أعطاني الله تعالى ولاية عدلت فيها ولم أعص الله تعالى بظلم وميل إلى خلق. If Allah gives me power, I will be just using that power, and I won't disobey God by any kind of preferential treatment or injustice. So he's talking about the intention that we often have, often in our almost fantasy lives. If I win the lottery, if I ever get rich, I would certainly do that. And sometimes we tell ourselves that this is an indication of our virtue. So is this true determination? This is what the Imam is looking at. فهذه العزيمة قد يصادفها في نفسه. A human being might well find this determination in his own self. وهي عزيمة جازمة صادقة. And it might well be a determined and sincere determination. وقد يكون في عزمه نوع ميل وتردد وضعف يضاد الصدق في العزيمة. Or alternatively, when a person is making these big claims about what he would do, there might be some kind of alternative inclination or weakness which challenges the sincerity and the truthfulness of his determination. فكان الصدق هاهنا عبارة عن التمام والقوة. So truthfulness in this context indicates completion and strength. So I truly intend to give away my wealth when I inherit, or if I get this kind of money. And that, when we say truly there, that indicates how real that is. That's a different kind of truthfulness. كما يقال لفلان شهوة صادقة. Just as we could say somebody truly has a desire. ويقال هذا المريض شهوته كاذبة. This sick person, he has a false appetite. He's pretending to have an appetite, but he's lying. His appetite is a lying appetite. It's not truthful. مهما لم تكن شهوته عن سبب ثابت قوي أو كانت ضعيفة فقد يطلق الصدق ويراد به هذا المعنى. فالصادق والصديق هو الذي تصادف عزيمته في الخيرات كلها قوية تامة. So the person who is sadiq, or the person who is siddiq, is the person who, when he has these determinations or these conditional experiences, if this happened, I would certainly do that, and I really wish it would happen because I could then do it. The siddiq person is the one who has that strongly. ليس فيها ميل ولا ضعف ولا تردد, without any hesitation or weakness. بل تسخو نفسه أبدا بالعزم المصمم الجازم على الخيرات, because such a person spends his whole life with a strong determination to do good things. وهو كما قال عمر رضي الله عنه لأن أقدم فتضرب عنقي في غير حد أحب إلي من أن أتأمر على قوم فيهم أبو بكر رضي الله عنه. Just as Umar said, رضي الله عنه, I would prefer to be beheaded for no crime than to be in authority over a people amongst whom was Abu Bakr. Because he was absolutely determined that Abu Bakr should always be the Amir. فإنه قد وجد في نفسه العزم الجازم والمحبة الصادقة, because he found in himself an absolute determination and sincere love. بأنه لا يتأمر مع وجود أبي بكر رضي الله عنه, determined that he would never ever be in authority over Abu Bakr. وأكد ذلك بما ذكره من القتل. And he was so sincere in this that he thought he'd rather die than be in that situation. So this is truthfulness in determination rather than truthfulness in act. And that's another important psychological insight, in that we are full of desires and wishes, and we need to examine those to see whether they are, first of all, compliant with what is good and true and proper in deen, but also to see the extent to which we're really sincere in those determinations. That's an indication of the orientation and the purity of our hearts. Number 4, الصدق الرابع في الوفاء بالعزم. Truthfulness number 4 is fulfilling one's determination, carrying it out. فإن النفس قد تسخو بالعزم في الحال إذ لا مشقة في الوعد والعزم. The human ego might well be very generous in determining things, in saying, I'll definitely do that, because there's no particular difficulty simply in making promises. والمؤنة فيه ضع خفيفة. There's very little effort required. فإذا حقت الحقائق وحصل التمكن, but when things actually come about and one is in a position to actually do that thing, وهاجت الشهوات, then the desires start to rise up. انحلت العزيمة, that big strong determination dissolves. وغلبت الشهوات, and the desires are victorious. ولم يتفق الوفاء بالعزم وهذا يضاد الصدق فيه. And carrying out one's determination doesn't happen, and this is the opposite of truthfulness. So even if one was truthful, if I win the lottery, I will give it all away to the local masjid, and then it does so happen that you get the right 6 numbers on your scratch card, and oh, mashallah, alhamdulillah, but then somehow, despite the sincerity, the truthfulness of your determination, now something else emerges. ولذلك قال الله تعالى رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه. So Allah says, men who were truthful to their covenants to God. فقد روي عن أنس أن عمه أنس ibn al-Nadr. It's narrated that Anas ibn al-Nadr لم يشهد بدرا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فشق ذلك على قلبه. He wasn't able to attend the Battle of Badr with the Holy Prophet, and this was very hard on his heart. وقال أول مشهد شهده رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم غبت عن. The first battle of the Holy Prophet that I've been absent from. أما والله لئن أراني الله مشهدا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليرين الله ما أصنع. If I ever get another chance to fight a battle in the presence of the Holy Prophet, God himself will see what I do. فشهد أحدا من العام القابل. The next year he was present at Uhud. فاستقبله سعد بن معاذ فقال يا أبا عمرو. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh confronted him and said, "Oh Abu Amr, where are you going?" فقال واهن لريح الجنة, and he said, the scent of paradise. إني أجدها دون أحد, I find it coming from the direction of Uhud. فقاتل حتى قتل, and he fought until he was martyred. فوجد في جسده بضع وثمانون ما بين رمية وضربة وطعنة, and around 80 stab marks were found in his body. فقالت أخته بنت النضر ما عرفت أخي إلا ببنانه. His sister said afterwards, I only recognized him from his fingers. ونزلت هذه الآية. This is when this verse came down. رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه. Men who were faithful to the pledges they had made to Allah. So this is another form of sidq, fulfilling one's promises. And in the honor code of Islam, this is particularly valued, that we are people who, when we undertake things and sign contracts, that we fulfill our promises, and this is part of the dignity and the sidq of the believer. ووقف رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على مصعب ibn عمير وَقَدْ سَقَطَ عَلَى وَجْهِهِ يَوْمَ أُحُدٍ شَهِيدًا. The Holy Prophet stood over the remains of Mus'ab bin Umair, who had fallen as a shaheed on the day of Uhud. وَكَانَ صَاحِبَ لِوَاءَ الرَّسُولِ, and he was the standard bearer of the Holy Prophet. فقال عليه الصلاة والسلام رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر. Men who were truthful to that pledge which they had made to Allah, and of them were some who died, and of others there were some who were ready. وقال مجاهد رجلان خرجا على ملأ من الناس قعود فقال إن رزقنا الله تعالى مالا لنصدقن فرزقوا. There are two people who went out and were speaking in a gathering, saying, if Allah gives us wealth, if we strike it rich, we shall certainly give it in charity. And then they did get rich. فَبَخِلُوا بِهِ, and they kept the money. فَنَزَلَتْ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ عَاهَدَ اللَّهَ لَئِنْ آتَانَا مِنْ فَضْلِهِ لَنَصَدَّقَنَّ وَلَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. So in this connection, the verse was revealed, and amongst them are those who made a pledge to Allah, saying, if Allah gives us of His bounty, we shall certainly give it out, and we shall certainly be of the Salihin. So, وقال بعضهم, some of them would say, إنما هو شيء نووه في أنفسهم لم يتكلموا به. This is something which they intended in themselves and didn't speak of. فجعل العزم عهدا وجعل الخلف فيه كذبا والوفاء به صدقا. So in this case, people like this, those who died fulfilling their pledge at Uhud, or those who were granted wealth and were stingy, this is another sense of truthfulness and falsity. Sidq and kadhib. Wafa, fulfillment of one's pledges, is one of the cardinal virtues of the believer and part of futuwa, part of spiritual chivalry. وهذا الصدق أشد من الصدق الثالث. This type of sidq, he says, is harder than the third type. فإن النفس قد تسخو بالعزم ثم تكيع عند الوفاء لشدته عليه. Because one might be sincere in feeling generous and determined to give money away, but then when the time comes to put one's money where one's mouth is, one finds it hard because of the difficulty of this thing. وَلِهَيَجَانِ الشَّهَوَاتِ عِنْدَ التَّمَكُّنِ, and because of the boiling up of the appetites and the egos. قال أبو سعيد الخراز, this is Abu Sa'id again, said, رأيت في المنام, I once had a dream in which I saw كأن ملكين نزلا من السماء فقال لي, I saw it was as though two angels had descended from heaven and said to me, asked me, ما الصدق, what is truthfulness? قلت الوفاء بالعهد, fulfilling one's promises. فقال لي صدقت وعرج إلى السماء, and they said, you've spoken the truth, and they went back to the garden. So this is another important part of truthfulness, not just having the determination to do good, but actually to do it if one has undertaken to do it to oneself or to others. الصدق الخامس في الأعمال. Truthfulness type 5 is in actions. وهو أن يجتهد حتى لا تدل أعماله الظاهرة على أمر في باطنه لا يتصف هو به. And this is that every Muslim should strive so that his outward actions do not indicate something in his inward part which is not truly there. لا بأن يترك الأعمال He doesn't do this by simply not bothering with the actions in the first place. ولكن بأن يستجر الباطن إلى تصديق الظاهر, but to force the inwardness to correspond with the outward form. So in the prayer, the outward form is there. You must force your inward praying self to comply with the outward movements. This is the ijtihad, the fight that we must embark upon. وهذا يخالف ما ذكرناه من ترك الرياء. And this is different from our discussion about abandoning ostentation. لأن المرائي هو الذي يقصد ذلك لأجل الخلق, because the ostentatious person is the one who is outwardly better because he knows others are watching. ولكن قلبه غافل عن الصلاة, and that person's heart is paying no attention to the prayer. فمن ينظر إليه يراه قائما بين يدي الله تعالى وهو بالباطن قائم في السوق. Somebody watching him might think he's standing before his Lord, but inwardly he's actually standing in the market, choosing between different things to which his appetite's attached. فهذه أعمال تعرب بلسان الحال عن الباطن إعرابا هو فيه كاذب وهو مطالب بالصدق في الأعمال. So this is where we are outwardly manifesting something, but we are actually lying in that action because we are saying and doing things that are not actually what we're doing in our hearts. So this also is a form of truthfulness that we need to achieve in order to overcome this inner inadequacy. وكذلك قد يمشي الرجل على هيئة السكون والوقار. Similarly, somebody, you may see him walking in a very dignified and upright way. وليس باطنه موصوفا بذلك الوقار, but inwardly he's not really a dignified person at all. فهذا غير الصادق في عمله. This person is not sincere in what he's doing. وإن لم يكن ملتفتا إلى الخلق ولا مرائيا إياهم. Even if he's not looking to see what people are thinking of him and is not showing off to them, he's still insincere. ولا ينجو من هذا إلا باستواء السريرة والعلانية. He can only escape from this inner falsity by making sure that he's inwardly what he is outwardly. بأن يكون باطنه مثل ظاهره أو خيرا من ظاهره, or ideally inwardly better than how he is outwardly. ومن خيفة ذلك اختار بعضهم تشويش الظاهر. And for fear of this, some of the early Muslims preferred to make themselves look outwardly not particularly impressive or compliant. وَلَبِسَ ثِيَابَ الْأَشْرَارِ. They wore the kind of clothes that undesirable people might wear. كَيْ لَا يُظَنَّ بِهِ الْخَيْرُ بِسَبَبِ ظَاهِرِهِ, so that nobody would mistake them for people of virtue. فَيَكُونُ كَاذِبًا فِي دَلَالَةِ الظَّاهِرِ عَلَى الْبَاطِنِ. For fear of this lying, that one is lying to people and to oneself by appearing to be what one actually is not. فإذا مخالفة الظاهر للباطن إن كانت عن قصد سميت رياء. So to sum up, if one's outward is in conflict with one's inward, if that is deliberate, that is considered to be ostentation, رياء. ويفوت بها الإخلاص, and there's no sincerity in that. وإن كان عن غير قصد, but if you don't do that deliberately, فيفوت بها الصدق, still there is no truthfulness. ولذلك قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم اللهم اجعل سريرتي خيرا من علانيتي واجعل علانيتي صالحا. This is in Tirmidhi, the Holy Prophet's prayer. O Allah, make my inward better than my outward and make my outward righteous. So here is distinguishing between the conflict between outward and inward, which is to show off to others, and the conflict which is just because of an inner inadequacy and a weakness, but is not necessarily based on the riya, but it is still a form of kadhib, a form of falsity. وقال أبو يعقوب النهجوري الصدق موافقة الحق في السر والعلانية. Sidq, according to this Sufi definition, is to coincide with, correspond to what is true inwardly, secretly and publicly. فإذا مساواة السريرة للعلانية أحد أنواع الصدق. Therefore, concluding this fifth penultimate section, the Imam concludes, for the inner and the outward to be equivalent is one of the varieties of truthfulness. So we see here really that the word sidq embraces more than the English word truthfulness. It means, again, being straight, being real, being honest, being authentic. So we move on now to the final section, section 6, the sixth type of sidq, at the end of the book of intention. الصدق السادس وهو أعلى الدرجات وأعزها الصدق في مقامات الدين. The highest of the degrees and the rarest is sincerity in the degrees of religion. Like sincerity in khawf, fear, raja, hope, ta'zim, glorification, zuhud, asceticism, rida, satisfaction with the last decree, hub, love, tawakkul, سائر هذه الأمور, and all of these things. فإن هذه الأمور لها مباد ينطلق الاسم بظهورها ثم لها غايات وحقائق. All of these things are named after the first point in their progression, and then they have endpoints and realities. والصادق المحقق من نال حقيقتها. So the truthful person, the one who is really sadiq in these, is the one who achieves the reality of this. Not just a little bit of fear of Allah, that's not really truthful fear, but real fear, real tawakkul, real mahabba. So the sixth form, again, is truthfulness in all of these religious virtues, inhabiting their inward purpose rather than just the beginnings of them. وإذا غلب الشيء وتمت حقيقته سمي صاحبه صادقا فيه كما يقال فلان صدق القتال ويقال هذا هو الخوف الصادق وهذه هي الشهوة الصادقة. So he's again talking about the linguistic aspects of this. You can speak of truthful fear and honest fighting and a truthful desire. This is the way the adjective's being used here. قال الله تعالى إنما المؤمنون الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ثم لم يرتابوا. The believers are only those who believe in Allah and His Messenger and then do not doubt. إلى قوله أولئك هم الصادقون. It is they who are the truthful. ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر إلى قوله أولئك الذين صدقوا. Goodness is to believe in Allah and the last day. At the end of the verse, they are those who have sidq. So much of this complexity of the discussion of sidq and truthfulness comes from the fact that the Quran uses this sadaqah, as-sadiqeen, as-siddiqoon, sadaqu, in quite a variety of ways. And we struggle a bit to find a fully comprehensive English rendering of these different usages. وسئل أبو ذر عن الإيمان فقرأ هذه الآية فقيل له سألناك عن الإيمان. Abu Dhar was asked about Iman and recited this verse. They are the truthful. And they said, we asked you about Iman. And he said, سألت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الإيمان فقرأ هذه الآية. I asked the Holy Prophet about Iman, and he recited this verse. So what he's saying here is that truthfulness in a religious or a spiritual virtue means a kind of intensity in it, not just having it at a weak and introductory level. talking here about different degrees of fear of Allah and the intensity of the fear that can overwhelm some people, and that's when it becomes really sadiq. قال جابر قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مررت ليلة أسري بي وجبريل بالملأ الأعلى كالحلس البالي من خشية الله تعالى. It's in the hadith of the Mi'raj. On the night when I was taken by night, I went with Jibreel past the highest assembly of angels, and I was like, it's almost like the blanket that's thrown down on an animal. It was completely overwhelmed, min khashyatillah, from the fear of Allah. وقال مطرف ما من الناس أحد إلا وهو أحمق فيما بينه وبين ربه إلا أن بعض الحمق أهون من بعض. Every human being, according to this Mutarrif, another early Zahid and Muhaddith, is foolish in his relations with God, except some people are less foolish than others. So a question of degrees again arises here. It's quite a long section. فهذا صدق في هذه الأمور. So this is the description of truthfulness in all of these matters. وكم من جلة الصحابة قد أدوا الصلاة واتبعوا الجنائز ولم يبلغوا هذا المبلغ. So he's been talking in one of these stories about some of the Sahaba who were able to be entirely present in their prayers every time and entirely attentive in a janazah. And the Imam then says, but this wasn't the case with all of the Sahaba. These are degrees, and this is to do with sidq. So to be truthful in the maqamat ad-din, the degrees of religion. فَهَذِهِ هِيَ دَرَجَاتُ الصِّدْقِ وَمَعَانِي. So these are the 6 degrees and senses in which we use the word sidq. والكلمات المأثورة عن المشايخ في حقيقة الصدق في الأغلب لا تتعرض إلا لآحاد هذه المعاني. And he says usually the sheikhs, when talking about sidq, only speak about some of these categories, but helpfully he's put them all together for us. نعم قد قال أبو بكر الوراق. Abu Bakr al-Warraq said الصدق ثلاثة صدق التوحيد وصدق الطاعة وصدق المعرفة. He said there's 3 kinds of sidq: truthfulness in tawheed, truthfulness in obeying God, truthfulness in knowledge. فصدق التوحيد لعامة المؤمنين. The first is for the ordinary believers who truly believe. قال الله تعالى والذين آمنوا بالله ورسله أولئك هم الصديقون. Those who believe in Allah and His messengers, they are the people of sidq. وصدق الطاعة لأهل العلم والورع. Truthfulness in obedience is for the people of knowledge and scrupulousness. وصدق المعرفة لأهل الولاية الذين هم أوتاد الأرض. And sincerity in knowledge, those who are genuinely taken to stages of unveiling and are in the presence of the divine glory, is for the people of wilaya, those people who are the tent pegs of the earth, those on whose prayers and holiness the good order of the world depends. وكل هذا يدور على ما ذكرناه في الصدق السادس. And all of that is to do with the 6th category of sidq which we've discussed. ولكنه ذكر أقسام ما فيه الصدق وهو أيضا غير محيط بجميع الأقسام. It does not covered by all of the others. وقال جعفر الصادق الصدق هو المجاهدة. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq said truthfulness is effort. وَأَلَّا تَخْتَارَ عَلَى اللَّهِ غَيْرَ اللَّهِ, and not to choose other than Allah over Himself. كما لم يختر عليك غيرك. Just as he himself has chosen you. فقال تعالى هو اجتباكم. Allah says he has chosen you. In other words, the divine attention is on you, and Allah doesn't get distracted. His sadiq towards you. You should also respond with the similar choosing of God. وقيل أوحى الله تعالى إلى موسى عليه السلام إني إذا أحببت عبدا ابتليته ببلايا لا تقوم بها الجبال. Allah once revealed to Moses, upon him be peace, when I love a slave, I test him with tribulations which the mountains themselves could not carry. لأنظر كيف صدقه, so I can see how truthful he is. فإن وجدته صابرا, if I find him patient with sabr, اتخذته وليا وحبيبا, I adopt him as a wali and as a beloved. وإن وجدته جزوعا يشكوني إلى خلقي خذلته ولم أبالي. And if I find him panicking and complaining about me to my creation, I abandon him and I do not mind. So Allah tests people, and to the extent that they're sincere and truthful, sadiq in their response and their bearing of that test, Allah raises them up to these extraordinary high levels of wilaya, siddiqiyya, mahabba. And if people don't like the test and they complain, oh Allah, why wasn't Allah helping me? Why did Allah do this? Etc., etc., and they're outside that circle. فإذا من علامات الصدق كتمان المصائب والطاعات جميعا. Therefore, one of the signs of the presence of truthfulness is that one should conceal the misfortunes which befall one, just as one conceals one's acts of piety. وَكَرَاهَةُ إِطِّلَاءِ الْخَلْقِ عَلَيْهَا, and one should not be happy when people notice. So just as the sincere person isn't happy when people come to know that that person is reading Qur'an a lot at night and is kind of upset by that, similarly, the righteous, the Siddiqeen, tend to conceal the misfortunes and don't talk about them and underestimate them, disregard them, make light of them. That's one of the signs of a sincere and decent human person. So we've come to the end of the book, alhamdulillah, the end of this 6th class. تم كتاب النية والإخلاص والصدق. The book of Niyyah and Ikhlas and Sidq is completed, it being the 7th book of the quarter of saving virtues of the books of the Ihya Ulumuddin. وَلِلَّهِ الْحَمْدُ وَالْمِنَّةِ وَصَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَى خَيْرِ خَلْقِهِ مُحَمَّدٍ النَّبِيِّ وآله الطاهرين وسلم تسليما يتلوه كتاب المراقبة والمحاسبة. He's just saying that the book of Muraqabah and Muhasabah follows. We're quite close to the end of the whole Ihya, of course. The next book is about Muraqabah and Muhasabah. In other words, being constantly aware of Allah's scrutiny. He's the Raqib. Muhasabah, constantly being aware of oneself and one's own inner turbulences, distractions, and so forth, being fully self-aware. And that's quite close to the concept of sidq. You can learn a lot from figuring out why the Imam puts these virtues where he does in the sequencing of his ihya. So alhamdulillah, we've come to the end of this journey, and if we only learn 10% of what the Imam is sharing with us, inshallah we'll be better human beings, because these are universal virtues. Whether people are religious or not, everybody respects people who are faithful, who fulfill their promises, who are sincere in their determinations, who are not privately other than what they publicly claim to be. This is part of human decency. And unfortunately, our twisted age, full of strange insincerities, is very far from this world of sidq. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants this degree of siddiqiyya to whomsoever He will. So at the end, inshallah, we make the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, tabaraka, in His blessedness, bestows this virtue of truthfulness, of honesty, of open-heartedness, of realness upon us, so that we can become exemplary and decent human beings, and that even if our actions fall short, inshallah, the intention of those actions is a good one. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to resurrect us according to the best of our intentions and according to His mercy, not according to the majority of our actions, and according to His justice. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Al-Fatiha. Amin ya Rabbal Alamin.